when we're talking about sustainability, we're talking, frankly, about how do we create fairer, more equitable communities? And how do we ensure that that is always at the center? Because you can't protect nature without people, and people can't thrive without nature. So how do we make sure that we're marrying that conversation? And how do we ensure our movement is an intersectional one, both because it's necessary to deliver solutions that, serve the majority of people, but also because it's a much more compelling and effective way to help people find their own place in what is a giant jigsaw.
Welcome to the Mongabay Newscast. I'm your co-host, Mike DiGirolamo, bringing you weekly conversations with experts, authors, scientists, and activists working on the front lines of conservation, shining a light on some of the most pressing issues facing our planet, and holding people in power to account. This podcast is edited on Gadigal land. Today's guest on the newscast is climate activist and founder of the youth-led nonprofit organization Force of Nature, Clover Hogan. Force of Nature provides tools and resources to young communities around the world to take action on climate change. Hogan has been an activist since she was 11 years old. With well over a decade of experience, she's seen the evolution of the global climate activist movement from a pretty unique perspective. She joins me in conversation today to reflect upon some of the lessons, insights, and inspirations from her work, as well as the challenges, exhaustion, burnout, and social and governmental backlash that activists face and continue to face today in countries around the world. Challenges that she highlights in the third season of her own podcast series, Confessions of a Climate Activist. In our discussion, she weighs in on some of the more surprising revelations from activists she has spoken with, and more effective ways forward for inclusive activism and the public responses and conversations about it. With that said, enjoy the conversation. Clover, welcome to the Mongabay Newscast. How are you?
I'm wonderful. Thank you so much for having me. I'm super excited about today's conversation.
I am really excited to have you as well. I've got a lot of questions for you. But before I get into it, what is Force of Nature? Can you just tell our audience, what is Force of Nature? What do you do with the organization?
So I started Force of Nature when I was 19. I'd been volunteering in schools across the UK talking to young people. And what I heard was a widespread feeling of anxiety and despair, anger, frustration about the climate crisis, which was very contrary to the narrative at the time about young people feeling inspired and empowered and passionate. Instead, I met young people who were really, really disillusioned about the state of the world and the future they were inheriting. And I recognized a need to support young people in those very valid but difficult emotions and help them channel those feelings into activism and creating change in their own communities. So Force of Nature was really born from that place. And today we're a youth-led nonprofit working with young people around the world, helping them take action on the issues they care about. We have a community of young people in now over 60 countries who are all doing their part to influence change in the world around them. And we also work with decision makers across business, policy, and education to make sure that young people have a seat at the table and are in the room when decisions are being made that affect our collective future.
And you run these things called climate cafes. Can you just explain to our listeners what those are?
Yeah, absolutely. So a big part of Force of Nature's work is running programs. So since 2019, we've been running workshops with young people around the world, safe spaces for them to come together, talk about how the climate crisis makes us feel, and then really, again, think critically about how we can channel those feelings into action. But in the lead up to, it was COP27, we heard this resounding feeling from young people of being left out of the conversation, of wanting to create spaces, not in the corridors of power, but in their own communities to really come together, meet with like-minded people, and kind of self-organize. And so climate cafes were born as spaces for people to come together to devise solutions, to meet like-minded peers. And we've since had climate cafes all around the world. We've had several hundred. And out of those climate cafes, which have been hosted in schools, cafeterias, churches, mosques, everything in between, shoe shops, we've had new initiatives born out of those spaces, new community gatherings. And it's been a really amazing exercise in seeing what young people can do when you give them a bit of a container of support and also resources. We launched a micro grant scheme to help young people overcome financial barriers to hosting their own climate cafes as well. And so we weren't expecting them to be as successful or kind of viral as they have been. But there is this real desire, not just among young people, but intergenerationally, to have in the digital age, physical spaces to actually come together and meet with people.
Yeah, definitely. So, I mean, you have quite a bit of experience under your belt as an activist, and this podcast season that you've released, which it has some really poignant reflections about the work of activists, things related to like feelings of exhaustion, burnout, like shame, imposter syndrome. Why did you decide to do this series?
So I think we often look to activists, particularly young activists, to inspire us and show us the way. I think particularly in the wake of Greta Thunberg, there's this kind of poster child effect that happens where we put activists on these pedestals. And many of the conversations I've had with young people, they've said, oh, these activists are really inspiring, but I could never do what they do. They're perfect and they live exactly in line with their values, and they're capable of using their voices in such compelling ways. And I could never do that. And yet, as an activist myself with a platform, I know that that is the very tip of the iceberg. And actually, there's a whole kind of behind the scenes of how difficult activism is that we don't really create space to talk about. And the more and more I kind of opened up to my community of activists, the more universal I realized some of those challenges were, from navigating really difficult family dynamics through to very consistent burnouts, kind of like burning the flame at both ends and just facing really chronic exhaustion. I observed more and more young people coming into this movement and really just having to leave it because they couldn't keep it up for a host of reasons, not just burnout, but also the standard of like unpaid labor, the fact that you're often expected to work for free as an activist, for the opportunity, the exposure is what you're often told by, event organizers or whoever else. And so we consistently kept hearing about these very like chronic issues, and even call out culture within activism, the kind of rise of infighting, which is social media has been a bit of a vehicle for as well. And this comparison culture, which kind of turns activists against one another rather than uniting around the problems. And so when there is this kind of rose-tinted window or vision of what activism or youth activism looks like, we really wanted to pull the curtain back and just have very honest, vulnerable, open conversations about the difficulties of activism so that people can open their eyes to the realities, recognize the different layers of privilege within activism as well, but also so that as a community, we can be really honest with ourselves and start addressing these really serious issues and recognize that only when we create space for these types of human conversations are we going to be effective as an intersectional movement. And so the podcast was really born out of that desire. In the last season, we did a deep dive into eco-anxiety and mental health specifically from lots of different angles. And this time around, it was really exploring the inner life of a whole host of different activists, and not just climate activists, but queer rights activists, racial justice activists as well, to see the kind of common threads across these different spaces and movements.
Yeah, it was, I mean, obviously I'm not like an activist in the sense that you are, but like I found myself empathizing with a lot of the challenges. So is it fair to say, or would you say it's fair to say that a lot of these challenges are experienced just by the population in general?
Yeah, in different ways for sure. I think a big thing that we've talked about over the past year is this myth of kind of perfection within activism. And I think that's something that sort of barricades lots of people, whether they consider themselves activists or not, from even engaging in the issues, is this idea that, you have to be vegan and you're not allowed to fly and you can't buy fast fashion, and this hyper obsession with kind of individual actions and lifestyle changes when it comes to climate that I think prevent so many people from even wanting to participate, because there is no real acknowledgement of the fact that like we live in systems and a culture, particularly in the West, that makes it fundamentally difficult to do what you might call like the right or responsible or sustainable thing. And so I think through that dimension, absolutely. I also think there's an episode where we go into navigating difficult familial dynamics and like difficult conversations with friends. And I think anyone who's gone home for Christmas can like probably relate to that one,
right?
Whether it's like across politics or whatever else, this fracturing and polarization that we feel within not just our communities at large, but within our families as well. And how do we navigate that? How do you have conversations with people you really, really disagree with? How do you find common ground? And such a focus of this podcast is, of course, mental health and burnout. And I think so many people have experienced burnout, even if they don't necessarily have that terminology or language. The experience of burnout is like so unique to each individual as well. And so the image that you might have in your head could be really different from your own experience, but that doesn't make it any less valid. And so I think whether it's within activism or out of it, just having much more frank, open, vulnerable conversations are so, so important so that we can create better spaces for people to be able to participate and feel safe to participate as well.
Right. Yeah. I mean, something that you touched upon, and there were often, I'm not going to like say exactly what they were because I want people to listen to it, but there were like some frank admissions of particularly using products like driving. But as you point out, these are systems where many of us are locked into. There are many people that can't simply take a train because they don't have access to one, for instance. And to that end, corporations have been pretty adept at putting the onus on people for the climate or biodiversity crises, like things like your carbon footprint, or putting the onus on you to reduce your impact, so to speak. How do you personally counter that narrative?
It's a great question. I think when I first became an activist, I was very young. I was about 11. And when I first learned about the issues, I was like, well, if everyone went plant-based or if everyone gave up fast fashion, like if we all just collectively make these changes, maybe we really can take on the problems. And then more and more, I learned first about the systemic nature of these crises. I think we've all heard that stat. If there are 100 companies responsible for 71% of global emissions, this idea that actually there are these organizations and institutions that have a disproportionate impact.
A quick note here, the study that Clover is referring to was released by the Carbon Majors database in 2017, which found that 100 fossil fuel producers are linked to 71% of industrial greenhouse gas emissions since 1988. Some people have said the study, as quoted in media outlets, is misleading, since it includes the emissions that come from people using products produced by corporations. But as Clover points out, many people are essentially locked into using these products for lack of having no other options, and thus individual actions can only do so much to mitigate them. The IMF estimates globally fossil fuel subsidies crested $7 trillion for the year 2022. Additionally, a study released in late 2022 shows that trade associations engaged on climate change spent $3.4 billion in 10 years on political activities, which are, quote, often to thwart policies designed to slow climate change. Authors were Christian Downey and Robert Brule, which you can read more information on in the outlet The Conversation. The Guardian also revealed in 2019 that there were just 20 fossil fuel companies directly linked with 1/3 of all carbon emissions.
Just simply learning about the distribution of wealth and resources, learning that the wealthiest 26 people own as much wealth as the poorest 3.8 billion on this planet, started to open my eyes up to power dynamics, essentially, and the fact that there is a small group of individuals who hold the majority of the world's wealth and resources.
The statistic that Clover just cited is from the Oxfam Public Good or Private Wealth Report from 2019.
And then I started to learn about the tactics of the fossil fuel industry and how considered and tactical this approach was to place the onus of responsibility on individuals. So I learned about the fact that it was BP, which was then British Petroleum and then rebranded to Beyond Petroleum in a stroke of greenwashing genius, who in the 2000s actually created the carbon footprint calculator.
The story Clover is referring to and the public relations strategies employed by fossil fuel companies are widely reported on by outlets such as The Guardian and others. As recently as 2023, BP has publicly denied they popularized a carbon calculator, However, testimony from a professor at the University of Miami given during the radio show On Point at the WBR indicates otherwise, but he welcomed BP to comment further on the situation.
So it was a fossil fuel company that thought of this really smart way to actually shine the spotlight of attention away from themselves and onto individuals. And I think over the past 10 years, we've seen a disproportionate amount of attention on individual actions and lifestyle changes. And companies, fossil fuel companies saying, what's your green pledge? How are you going to do your bit by turning off the lights when you leave a room or reusing a coffee cup or whatever? And people intuitively know like how ridiculous that is. And I think we're now being really honest with ourselves about just how strategic that approach from these big companies has been. We see it with the rise of like so-called green or sustainable products as well. I know within environmentalism, we're all familiar with greenwashing, but there are now dozens of different terms from green crowding to green labeling to green hushing, just to try and keep up with and capture the myriad devices invented by companies to greenwash and to spend more time being seen to do the right thing than actually doing it. So I think all to say, it's no accident that we spend so much of our time thinking about our individual lifestyles and not thinking about how do we actually hold these systems accountable. And so one of the ways that we've kind of tackled that and addressed it in the podcast is with Climate Confessions, to basically just point at how silly it is that we feel guilty about our individual actions, whether it is that you drive in a car or maybe you bought fast fashion one time,
right,
against the scale of the problem that is frankly being driven by these huge organizations.
Right. And it is like a really difficult position activists are in here, because when activists do activism or protest, there's a lot of stigma and social backlash that comes with this. And I want to get into that with you a little bit. But first, I have this question that I want to ask about the act of being an activist in the first place. There's like this threat that in doing this activism, you're losing your youth to this cause and not spending it doing something else, that is quote unquote normal or anything else. So do activists ever tell you, or has anyone ever told you that they would rather be doing something like learning a skill or pursuing a career in art or doing anything else?
Yeah, absolutely. I've had some pretty heartbreaking conversations with young activists. And I mean, the first disclaimer that I'll place here is that it's so different for everyone, and it's so affected by what it personally means to be an activist, but also what activism means in the place that you live. The fact that there are many activists I know who live in countries where it's essentially illegal to be outspoken against your government. I have friends who have lost friends of their own and family members because of their activism. So I think for everyone, it's very different in terms of how they kind of own the work they do and own that identity and that label in particular. But I've for sure heard from so many young people this feeling of, I guess, resentment for having to do this work, and not just do this work, but do it in such a hostile environment. Even in the UK, where I'm not fearing for my own life personally being an activist, I have been vilified by mainstream media. Me and my friends were consistently branded environmental terrorists for participating in protest. And so, you are in a hostile environment doing this work, and that is really difficult. I've had friends of mine say, I just wish I could go to university. Or I just wish I could become a baker. I just wish I could get on with living my life and being a teenager and doing teenage things rather than having to focus on such heavy and existential problems. And I think as an activist, it's really hard to also hold the multiplicity of that as well, particularly when you're young. There's an episode that we recorded with Sophia Kiani, who founded an amazing nonprofit called Climate Cardinals, translating climate resources and education into lots of different languages. And she was talking about the backlash that she's received because she's a college student, and she'll post content of her just going out for drinks or going to a party or hanging with friends. And she'll get backlash from her own community of people saying, but why aren't you out there protesting? Why aren't you organizing? And so there's this pressure and expectation that if you decide to become an activist and you make that your kind of identity or brand or whatever you want to call it, then you're not allowed to be other things. You don't have the license to also be a whole human or to make mistakes. And so I think that scrutiny is really, really difficult. And I've definitely felt this in myself. I think particularly when I'm depleted or burnt out, this just feeling of frustration, this questioning of like, why am I doing the work that I'm doing? And when I get to those moments, I try to reframe my thinking in two ways. I think for one, I remind myself of the privilege that I have in being able to do this work without fearing for my life, for my livelihood, the privilege of even being able to ask the question of, will I do this work? Because so many people who are already living through the climate crisis, they don't have the privilege of asking themselves that question. In many ways, they're stripped of their agency because they're in survival mode. They're just trying to get by. So I'm reminded of it from that aspect. And I think the other aspect as well is just reminding myself of like, aren't I fortunate that I get to live in a moment in time where I can have an influence in a really big way on the problems that are shaping our lives. I remind myself of like how wonderful it is that I'm part of this like incredible global community of people who care just as deeply, who are committing their lives to doing this work. And so I try to reframe it, but that doesn't mean that there aren't days where I and other activists wake up and question why we're doing this.
Yeah, I mean, and I can totally understand and see why. And you mentioned the pressure of like people asking, why aren't you going out and protesting? And I just want to point out something here. So there's been across the world rising reprisals against activists, really in many countries, from places like the UK to Australia to Tanzania, where there's intimidation through charges like subversion or illicit association, terrorism, or even tax evasion. The Guardian did an investigation on this, and they found that these things are increasingly being targeted towards activists. The article in question is How Criminalization is Being Used to Silence Climate Activists Around the World, published by The Guardian in October of 2023. I've linked it in the article summary of this episode. Additionally, a report by the UK watchdog Global Witness found that in both 2021 and 2022, an environmental defender was killed every other day. I mean, it's a real threat. So how do you face that? In addition to the already challenging dynamics that you're dealing with some of your colleagues, how do you deal with this extra layer?
I know of a number of activist groups that have had to go underground because of changing kind of like political regimes. I know that's true in India, for example. There are many, many activists, and there was this a few years ago fast-growing kind of activist community. You even think about figureheads like Vandana Shiva, and like India has given rise to so many incredible spiritual leaders and change makers and activists, and many of them, because of the political climate, have had to go underground. I have friends who are being taken to court by the governments, friends who are not allowed to leave the country, and most certainly not allowed to speak out against the country on social media or when they're permitted to leave global conferences and that type of thing. So there are very real on-the-ground challenges, and not only in countries like India, but Indonesia, the Philippines as well, where it is a genuinely existential threat. And we know that each year, many, many environmental defenders, land defenders are killed by their governments and also by corporate power players as well. So it's a scary time to be an activist. And I think, as you alluded to, there's a regression in a lot of our rights, and not just as activists or people who consider themselves activists, but people just speaking out. And we've seen that in the UK, for example, with the policing bill, where, you know, whether you're standing in the streets protesting for Palestine or you're protesting as part of Extinction Rebellion, there are now a whole host of different laws basically saying that, well, actually, you can get arrested if you're making too much noise, or if you use chalk on the sidewalk, or if you're quote unquote just like a public nuisance, and it's at the discretion of law enforcement officers to decide whether they'll lock you up or not. And even people being retrospectively arrested before this bill came into power. So it is just stunning.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, so much we talk about the politics, but it's also the media climate, as I mentioned. And the fact that the media, and particularly the Murdoch press, for example, are kind of like working overtime to turn public opinion against activists and against people who really are simply trying to defend human rights or fight for a livable planet. And so I definitely have a lot of moments of just like, am I going crazy? Because like so much in the culture kind of like gaslights us or tells us so. And so it's really difficult. It's really, really difficult. I think what's super important is like global solidarity and having conversations with different groups of activists and just creating spaces where people can directly address and talk about the different challenges they're facing in their own communities. For those of us who do have additional like privilege or influence or resources, for example, living in countries like the UK, having frank conversations about like how we can support what is needed in more vulnerable communities. And I think otherwise just like not sleeping on these regulations that are getting pushed through to strip us of our democratic right to take to the streets, to protest, to be activists and to challenge these systems of power.
So I want to shift gears and talk a little bit more directly about the podcast, because of the 5 episodes that are out right now, they're all very interesting and I recommend our listeners to go check it out. Without spoiling too much, what are some of the most surprising insights that you got from doing this that maybe you weren't like expecting to hear, but that just surprised you?
So many. I mean, it was really interesting because pretty much everyone who I got to interview this season, I know personally. They're friends of mine. It's a relatively small community in the world of youth activism, but there were lots of things that we'd never really been honest with ourselves about or really addressed, and things that surprised me. I think definitely what surprised me was like the number of interviewees and friends of mine who no longer considered themselves activists, or at least used that language because of the hate they'd received on social media, because of the call out culture, because of how, a lot of social media and activism has kind of become this like circular firing squad of tearing one another down. And I've experienced that in big and small ways. I remember questioning, I went to a Starbucks and my boyfriend took a photo of me and I wanted to post it on social media. And I remember having this moment of questioning of like, oh God, do I post this photo? I don't want to endorse Starbucks, obviously, but I don't want to lie to people. I don't want to like conceal the fact that this is like the way that I'm living my life and the fact that I am super inconsistent as an activist. All to say, I went ahead and posted this photo and I received a barrage of messages from people saying, I can't believe you would support a brand like Starbucks. I can't believe you would get coffee from here. I can't believe X, Y, Z. And that's just like a microcosm of some of the experiences that friends have had, because there's so much kind of misalignment, I guess, within activism of like the different theories of change. Like, what is the best approach to take on some of these problems? And I have activists and friends who do glue themselves to the road, who glue themselves to the headquarters of Shell, who are very much like boots on the ground. I have friends who have obstructed pipelines, who are incredibly brave, putting their bodies on the line. And I have friends who go into parliament and who are negotiators and who are trying to find commonality with the people who others would consider are the problem. And so I think when there is such a diverse array of different approaches, that is a really ripe environment for people to kind of point the finger and say, well, that's not the way to do it. We're not going to solve the problem that way. And actually, like, my approach is the correct approach. And so I think one of the things that definitely surprised me was just like how many young people had essentially, if not stopped their activism, stopped being so public about their activism because of the constant kind of scrutiny and just the toll that kind of takes on you. And I think the fact that like oftentimes that scrutiny came not in the way of like trolling from like anonymous people on the internet, which is frankly pretty easy to deal with. You're like, I don't even know if this is a real person. It could be a robot. Like, I'm just going to like put that on the back burner, compared to receiving this hate from like people you know and like people you've worked with. That I think is very destabilizing and really, really difficult to get through. I think the other element as well was just hearing, there's a great episode with Jaden Caulfield and Ben Hurst, who come at activism from very different angles. Jaden's background is in a working class family, in a working class community, a very deprived neighborhood. where he faced poverty in lots of different aspects of his life growing up in the UK. And Ben, who's coming from the angle of like racial justice and having worked on those issues, and then very much later in his life, entering into the arena of like climate and sustainability specifically. And I think just hearing from both of their perspectives about why environmentalism had often not felt like a safe space for them to participate, why the climate movement is, broadly speaking, like so white, so middle class, like particularly in the UK, and understanding what those barriers are, both like financially, but also like culturally, that prevent a more diverse array of people participating. And I think what's interesting is just like how intersectional each of these conversations and issues are. When we're talking about who is represented in the climate movement, that also opens up a conversation about like unpaid labor and why that is such a barrier to access, because actually you need to have a degree of privilege to even have the time or resource or like protections to participate in a protest. And that is just not the reality for so many young people in this country. So yeah, I loved the conversations. They were really insightful. And I think I came out of the experience having a much more nuanced idea of what it means to be an activist today.
Yeah. Yeah, I have to say it surprised me too to hear a guest or two say that they don't use the word or identify with the word activist, but correct me if I'm wrong, but they're still doing the work of an activist, so to speak. They're just not aligning themselves with the identity of one.
Exactly. Because I think, and for so many different unique reasons, but I think largely because it has become such a politicized term, and there is almost this barrier to entry in that you have to tick certain boxes, or in some instances, like particularly in the age of social media, like you have to perform in a particular way to feel like you have the license to consider yourself an activist. And this is a really interesting, like, ongoing debate that I also have with friends and like I have internally, because I've always come at the approach of like, we need millions of like imperfect activists, right? We need millions of people participating who, wherever they are in their journey, feel emboldened to consider themselves activists. Because I think when it is part of your identity, it's easier to participate and it's easier to feel part of a community. And yeah, I've also had CEOs come to me and say, well, can I consider myself an activist? And so it's a really challenging question, because it's like, well, should there be gatekeeping on activism? Because if someone who from the outside you might say is part of the problem in a big way considers themselves an activist, does that dilute what it means to be an activist? Or does that in fact make it more mainstream and more visible and more accessible? So it's a really difficult question.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I want to wade into this, but I'm going to ask it to you anyway. There seemed to be this point over the past couple of years where, once like people started throwing soup on paintings, the conversation got quite ugly. And I was actually in a museum and I was with a friend, and he's not a journalist or in the environmental space. And he goes, Mike, what do you think of that? Do you think that helps or hurts the situation? And I thought that was a really good question. And so I'm curious, what would be your response to that question?
I get asked this a lot. What's my take on the soup throwing? I will share an observation from what I've seen with Extinction Rebellion as a movement in the UK, because I think its kind of character arc is really interesting. So when XR first came onto the scene, there was definitely criticism, but I think there was more curiosity. I think in large part because it was very different from the types of protests people had seen before. I know when I attended my first XR protest, I was like, wow, this is like such a colorful and like joyful space. They'd shut down a big bridge in London, but it was colorful. There was free food. There was music. They brought all of these plants into the space. And so you could actually imagine what a more green London could look like. And they were engaging passersby, and it felt very family friendly. And around about that time, like public opinion was like broadly quite positive, I would say. But there was this very definitive turning point where Extinction Rebellion, they would always put different actions to a collective vote. And someone suggested, okay, what if we stopped this or shut down this particular train in London, in Canning Town? And people unilaterally voted against it within the movement because they said, this is going to optically look really bad because that particular station, it's used by a lot of like working class people who are just like trying to get to work. It's hurting people who were not trying to actually confront or challenge, right? We're trying to shut down the London economy to capture the attention of politicians, which up until that point had actually been quite effective. Like the UK was the first or one of the first countries to actually declare a climate emergency off the back of Extinction Rebellion's actions. However, even though there was that universal vote against the action, there were like some people who kind of like defected and decided to do it anyway. And sure enough, because that particular action really very like tangibly hurt a minoritized group of people, it turned public opinion very quickly. And then there was kind of this snowballing effect of like Extinction Rebellion is white and middle class and privileged, and you're out of touch with like everyday people who you should be trying to include in your movement and who you should be trying to get on side.
As reported on by The Guardian in 2019, 8 Extinction Rebellion members were arrested, and members within its political leadership expressed regret over the protest.
And so in part because of that, Just Stop Oil essentially evolved as like a spin-off from Extinction Rebellion. So the Extinction Rebellion could continue being a more accessible general movement, and JSO could be a more radicalized, doing the shutting down highways and throwing paint in museums and that kind of thing. And the reality is, like, when those more radical actions are taken, they do bring climate into the media. And that is the attention, right? Like, how do we stop everyone in their tracks and get this global attention on the issue? And yet, because of the nature of the media landscape, it's never actually reported on as climate, and they're acting because there's a climate emergency. It's framed as these people being a public nuisance, tarnishing a public space like a museum, which is funded by the everyday taxpayers' dollars. So it's a really challenging one, because I think in a different media landscape, it would be an opportunity to galvanize more public support and like put it in people's faces and get people talking. But I think in today's media landscape, from the conversations I've had, it's probably done more to turn people off the issue, because the story isn't about the issue. It's about this group of people who are doing something that the public considers like annoying and just like disruptive to their everyday lives.
So my follow-up question to that would be, what would you rather like to see then?
I think much more targeted actions to the people who are making these decisions in policy. I think when we recognize that the media landscape is where it is, it's probably not effective to keep going down that route. And so, you know, I've seen JSO take actions like sitting on Rishi Sunak's house, for example, which I thought was like genius.
It is important to note Just Stop Oil activists were not sitting directly on the house itself, but rather on the cobblestones outside of the house on the street. According to the BBC, they were banging pots and pans at night. 16 of them were arrested. Just Stop Oil expressed disapproval at the Prime Minister's decision to grant 100 new North Sea oil and gas licenses.
It's like, yes, like we need to actually be targeting like Parliament, we need to be targeting the House of Lords, we need to be targeting companies. Like I think when organizations actually shut down headquarters at Shell or BP, or I've seen some amazing activations of like when fast fashion companies like Shein or H&M have these kind of industry conferences, and people who infiltrate those spaces and act as this pattern interrupt to just challenge the status quo and actually say, what are we all doing here? Like, you guys are the problem. I think those actions are so incredibly important, and I think it takes tremendous bravery to do it. I've done it a couple of times in a small way, and I can tell you it is really uncomfortable. Like, it is not nice standing up and like speaking out and being heckled, being booed. It's deeply uncomfortable, but it's really, really important work. And when I have been in those spaces, even if you feel like you're standing alone in a crowd of people, so often people who are in the room will follow up with you after and say, thank you so much for saying that, or thank you so much for giving me the license to now have a difficult conversation with my peers or my boss or whoever. So it is really worthwhile work. I do just think we have to be super strategic in which spaces we're disrupting and who we're targeting through our actions.
So I want to talk about this idea of remaining hopeful amidst this environmental breakdown or impunity for injustice. And some folks point out that remaining hopeful for a better future can sometimes sound almost passive, like a passive attitude, rather than in the midst of these huge existential crises. Do you have hope, or do you keep your mind welded on action, or is it a healthy mix of the two?
I love this phrase that hope is a verb. This idea that hope is something you do. Because I definitely, when I'm often asked, like, are you optimistic about the future? Like, I feel this agitation rising in me because, to your point, it feels very passive. It's kind of like it feels like a coping mechanism born out of like the discomfort of sitting in the crisis and acknowledging where we are. It's like, oh, but someone will save the day, or we'll figure it out, or human ingenuity or technology will fix the issue. And so I think of it more as like, how do I exercise hope? How do I generate my own hope? And how do I also create a mental ecosystem or landscape that is capable of like holding many truths at once? Because I don't think it's a binary. I don't think it's like either you feel despair or you feel hope. It's probably some mix or combination of the two that changes on any given day, because the crisis itself is not binary. There's this obsession with, will we succeed or fail to solve the climate crisis? And as you and I know, everything is not only in degrees, but fractions of degrees, like literally in terms of like 1.5 versus 2 degrees of warming. Like when we're fighting for degrees, like we're fighting for every fraction of a degree, right? Because that genuinely equates to millions of lives. And so oftentimes we hear, oh, well, there's only 6 years left to solve the climate crisis, or this COP is the COP that determines the fate of humanity. And those are great Hollywood blockbuster titles, but they're not reality. So I try to find somewhere kind of in the messy middle, and I focus really on like, what are the stories that I can hold to be true that do not switch me off from the crisis, but that allow me to exercise my agency and feel empowered. Because I think so many people that I speak to feel deeply disempowered, whether they're CEOs or like students in the classroom, and they all have variations of the same stories playing out in their heads, whether that's, I'm 1 in 8 billion people. What difference can I possibly make? Or I'm not smart enough or experienced enough. I'm not a scientist. What can I contribute? Or the system is just too broken and too complex to fix. And there is a grain of truth in each of those stories, right? Yes, you alone as an individual cannot solve the problems. And yet, throughout history, we've seen that individuals working collective in people-powered movements do have the potential to change the world, right? Whether it's the suffragettes or the civil rights movement or the Stonewall Uprising. It is people who have come together in collective against seemingly impossible odds, who, with courage in their hearts, have fought for justice and have done incredible things that, and who haven't necessarily been alive to even see the outcomes of their actions. So that's another thing that kind of grounds me, is looking back to history and knowing that I am merely carrying the baton of generations past who have fought for the environment, who have fought for justice, who have fought for equality, but that I will also be part of a lineage that continues after me as well. And I think that's a very humbling reminder for all of us working in activism, that we may not be alive to even see the outcomes of our own actions, but we take action not because we're clinging on to some idea of a shiny, sparkly future, but because we know morally, ethically, right in this present moment, it's the right thing to do.
I think I have time for one more question here. Is there, obviously, climate change gets a lot of the limelight and a lot of activists start off in climate. Is there an issue that you wish more activists would focus on? Or this doesn't have to be just activists, but it could be the general public as well. I mean, because there's many different planetary boundaries and different issues that one could focus on, like biodiversity or deforestation. Is there an issue that you think deserves more attention?
When I think about climate, I think about it as the umbrella issue, because the climate crisis is ultimately a product of a broken food system, our relationship to consumption. It's a product of the way that companies create value. It's also a product of like a centuries-long history of colonization. It's a symptom of how we've come to commodify nature and spiritually divorce ourselves from nature and also from community. And so I think of climate as that kind of umbrella that is the meta problem made up of all of the problems. But there's a real marketing issue with climate, which is that typically when we think about climate change, we think about degrees of warming or carbon dioxide. We see this very narrow view. You know, companies have become more and more literate talking about like net zero. But when they're talking about net zero, they're not necessarily talking about equity. They're not talking about social justice or human rights. They're not thinking about biodiversity and ecosystems collapse. So I think rather than getting people to focus on another issue or a particular problem, I would say we have a really important job, particularly as storytellers and communicators, to help people see the intersectionality of all of these different challenges. Because I also think that creates a more effective road into the movement, because that means that you don't have to necessarily be passionate about fashion or food or education or nature or politics. You could be passionate about prison reform or girls' education or reproductive rights and see the direct connection and relationship between all of those issues and the relationship to climate as well. And I think particularly as a sustainability and climate movement, I would say in many ways, we're quite good at understanding the relationship to nature, quote unquote, like we are nature, but nature in the sense of like ecosystems and flora and fauna. And we have done a less good job at grounding our movement in the fight for social justice and human rights. And something that I've been advocating for a lot over the past few months is obviously like justice in Palestine, speaking up for the rights of people in Gaza, educating myself on the history of Israel-Palestine and the decades-long oppression that Palestinians have faced at the hands of Israeli occupation. And I've seen it as my responsibility as an environmental activist to both educate myself, but then with that education, use my platform and speak to this issue. And at the same time, like, have experienced a lot of backlash in response to that. And a lot of people saying, you're a climate activist, why are you talking about Palestine? Or why are you talking about what's happening in Sudan or the Congo? You know, why are you talking about these human rights crises? And it's like, well, the climate crisis is a human rights crisis, right? We're talking about the most vulnerable populations and communities of people. And if we fail to center justice and human rights in our conversations, then we're going to emerge with quote unquote climate solutions that continue to perpetuate the existing system of poorly distributed wealth, of inequality, of a small number of individuals profiting off the back of billions of people. We've seen a very clear example of that in like the rise of electric vehicles, for example, which have been heralded as like this silver bullet solution. We've seen with the increased demand in EVs, there's been increased demand in cobalt. The majority of the world's cobalt is mined in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And we've seen an explosion in human rights abuses, of slave labor, of terrible working conditions. And many people in the global north have found it really convenient to just look the other way and ignore those human rights abuses because they can get their shiny EVs at the end of the day and feel good that they're quote unquote doing their bit to help the planet.
Quick note, Mongabay has done an entire podcast episode on this exact subject and the impacts on the people of the DRC. If you're interested to learn more, you can find it on the Mongabay Explorers podcast feed. It is episode 4 in the Congo Basin season.
And so I'm very passionate about ensuring that when we're talking about sustainability, we're talking, frankly, about how do we create fairer, more equitable communities? And how do we ensure that that is always at the center? Because you can't protect nature without people, and people can't thrive without nature. So how do we make sure that we're marrying that conversation? And how do we ensure our movement is an intersectional one, both because it's necessary to deliver solutions that, you know, serve the majority of people, but also because it's a much more compelling and effective way to help people find their own place in what is a giant jigsaw.
Clover, it has been an absolute privilege speaking with you. Thank you so much for jumping onto the podcast and speaking with me today.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for the excellent questions as well.
If you would like to check out Clover Hogan's work, Force of Nature, or its third podcast season, Confessions of a Climate Activist, please see the link provided in the show notes. As always, if you're enjoying the Mongabay Newscast or any of our podcast content, like our sister series Mongabay Explores, and you want to help us out, we really encourage you to spread the word about the work we're doing by telling a friend. Word of mouth is definitely the best way to help expand our reach, but you can also support us by becoming a monthly sponsor via our Patreon page at patreon.com/Mongabay. We are a nonprofit news outlet, so $1 per month does make a difference and helps us offset production costs and hosting fees. So if you're a fan of our audio reports from Nature's Frontline, head to patreon.com/Mongabay to learn more and support the Mongabay Newscast and all of our podcast content. You and your friends can join the listeners who have downloaded the Mongabay Newscast well over 500,000 times by subscribing to this podcast wherever you get your podcasts from, or you can download our app for Apple and Android devices. Just search either app store for the Mongabay Newscast app to gain fingertip access to new shows and all of our previous episodes. And you can also read our news and inspiration from Nature's Frontline at mongabay.com, or you can follow us on social media, find Mongabay via our accounts on LinkedIn at Mongabay News, or on Instagram, Threads, Blue Sky, Mastodon, Facebook, and TikTok, where our handle is at Mongabay, or on YouTube at Mongabay TV. Thank you, as always, for listening.